Hello, Fernande. Welcome to the Transformational Learning Summit.
Hi, Lawrence. Thank you so much for having me.
I'm really happy to be having this conversation. As soon as I saw the work that you were doing in the world, I was like, I have to interview you. So I'm glad that we could make this work. And I'd like to start by asking you, what does the word transformation mean to you?
Since we started with a moment of silence before starting our conversation, um, I think transformation is, for me, bridging the two sides of that silence, right? On the one hand, um, the process of noticing, sensing, listening, hearing what is existing and what is possible, dreaming a whole lot, then being still, and then imagining, okay, how do we get to a place that is new, that is providing what the longing that you're hearing is asking for, right? So transformation is that process of moving us collectively as human beings to a place that we're longing for, and seeing how we can step into our possibility as human beings to create that. I guess that's, I don't have a ready-made transformation, but
That
you know,
that that might be the coolest
spontaneous
definition.
question. So it's sort
That
of
might be the coolest definition I've heard so far. I
okay.
love the way you wove our moment of stillness into there. That really touches me. Yeah. I'd love to open up the conversation to learn, to hear from you a little more about the work that you're doing with History Colab.
Uh, yeah, happy to. And I think having just talked about what transformation means, that is sort of the core of what we do as the collab. We're not, initially, we started off as an organization, we still are, uh, in a moment of frustration with a reality in the US that we had elected someone into the office of the president who, in my feeling, was not someone who actually believed in the institution of democracy. And I was like, how can you possibly get to a point in what is current, generally talked about as the world's oldest, functioning democracy? How do you get to a point where people are disconnected from an understanding of what democracy actually means? And that digging into that question, I looked into what happens in the education system. I wasn't in the world of education before that. I'm a historian and was in the world of social entrepreneurship. I mean, looking into the world of education, I realized that I saw a system that was created towards metrics of success and achievement that had nothing to do with the human project of creating a system for thriving and for more equality and more freedom and more justice and more energy toward transformation, right? This is not
Mm,
an education system that was preparing young people to step into their role in history, to step into their full humanity. So it's like, how can we re-architect this system of learning so that it is allowing people to step into their full humanity as both an individual that understands who they are, the people that are around them, and can connect with them and see who they are in their full story and their authentic self, and then see who we are as a community and how we're connected to each other and the planet, and then envision what do we do as agents of history, makers of history, because we're
mm,
always making history. You're on the planet in time, and so you're a maker of history. So the History Colab isn't so much about how do we teach kids better history. It was about how do we create a collaborative that allows us to make history for thriving, right, in a more meaningful way, that advances the well-being of individuals and our communities and the planet. So that's the work we do as the collab, which is a big, hairy systems question, right? It's not, we don't, we do now design curricula, but it wasn't designed to be a product creating organization initially. It was like, how do we figure out the whole systems change? And in that, we realized we do need some products to show what we're talking about, because people were like, what? Are you talking about a new textbook? I'm like, no, no,
mm.
no, no, no. I'm talking about a new learning operating system. And they're like, what do you mean?
Mm,
So we've had to become a place that operationalizes that, right? And there are different parts of it, but I guess that's sort of the overall framing, right? How do we
mm,
become a design lab that advances human thriving and allows education to create a generation that is empowered to be connectors and creators and shapers and dreamers and doers and lovers and all that,
Mm.
which is not how we usually think about history, but that's kind of how we see it.
I love the boldness and the bigness of the vision. And I want to kind of zoom in here for a moment because I encounter a lot of people who have these big visions, really heart-centered people who they want to transform some system or make some sort of meaningful change. And what really inspires me about what you're doing is that you've had this big, bold vision and you're really disturbed by something going on in the United States and you're actually making it happen in a really meaningful way and in a very tangible way. And so I'd love to maybe like if you could zoom in on any like key point of going from wow, this is something that is alive for me. It's somehow burning me. I want to do something here to the crucible of making that somehow tangible. Like what
Yeah.
how did you transform your initial inspiration into the tangible stuff that has become this History Colab?
Well, I think the first process was going out into the world and I love talking to people, right? I love connecting with people and human beings. And when you have this big idea and this big vision, to go and find the people that have the same idea and vision and yearning and longing and different pieces of the puzzle of how to get there, right? So I was I worked at Ashoka before thinking about, and the last project I did was about systems change, leadership. And how do you envision the process of how do you get from point A to point B, right? And there are all sorts of people that think about systems change and their theories of systems change. And we looked at all these theories of systems change and the different kinds of leadership. So when I had this big idea, I drew a nerdy little graph based on the systems change framework there's lots of frameworks, and I played with all of them. And I drew this picture of the systems change framework that Senge and Kramer and Kanya made about this waters of systems change triangle. And I looked at it and I said, well, these are all the big pieces that have to shift. I need to change everything about what's measured in school. We need to create ecosystems with relationships. We need to empower young people's voice so that we change the energy and the power structures. And we need to change the mental model about why we teach history. And then I started shopping around to find people that had pieces of that puzzle because I can't change the future of assessment. Who am I kidding? I'm just me. I can't change how we measure a success in school, but you just go around and you talk to people and you can find people who can do that, right? Who
Mm.
have organizations, who have systems that could do that. So you look at what's the power structure holding that in place, and you just go hunt people, right? With threads and puzzle pieces. And I got very lucky to find uh, uh, fantastic human beings that have some of those puzzle pieces, right? And then getting together and be like, what could we do together? Like what do we have that gears towards this vision? You have a vision, I have a vision. We have an outcome that we see of world of expanded thriving that's made possible by a new form of learning. What do we got? And who do we know that we can pull into this kind of a team of teams towards that end? So I guess that was the first part of it. And then grabbing on to people and places where a part of that could become a reality, right? So you have a theory, a little picture on your square of we need to have young people be empowered, and have their voice heard. And I met a young person at a convening in India on holistic well-being and education, summoned by a dear friend of mine from Ashoka. And there was a young person there who was incredible, 16, 17 at the time. And we were sitting at breakfast and he said, he was airing his frustration about always being celebrated as this young change maker and that adults usually didn't really care. And the whole system was skewed against youth power and school was so dumb anyway. And school was not actually, whatever, complaining and talking about the frustrations he had in school. And I shared what I wanted to do. And he said, oh my God, it's great. I wish I'd known you because my history class was so awful. I had to make my own. And this is, shared what he had wanted to do and what he did. And I said, well, what would you want to make happen in order for young people's voice to be heard? And then he shared the idea of creating a podcast that shows what young people really are passionate about. And so I said, well, let's do it. I have this vision. I'm an entrepreneur. I know how to make stuff happen. Let's just make it. So what do you mean make it? We can just make a podcast. I mean, yeah, we can. I know a guy. He's like a podcast guy. I know someone like we can find money. It's like it's just money. Like we can. And so it's like, okay, let's go. And so I know people, I know historians, like we have ingredients. We just need a recipe for the soup, and we need some money to buy the like some stuff. So we did, right? So we made a podcast together called Untextbooked, and the mantra was always, go big or go home. Like we're not going to make something small that 10 people listen to. If we're going to make something, we're going to make a podcast, like a real podcast. So we made this podcast Untextbooked, and the new website is going live tomorrow. It's whatever. I think it's the #2 U.S. history podcast on Apple
That's
Podcast,
amazing.
like
That's so awesome.
Spotify, new, like it's
Mm.
gotten all these awards and blah, blah, blah. It's still really hard to get money for it because people are like, what are you? Are you a youth program? Are you a media company? Are you a
Mm.
education thing? I have a foundation budget for democracy, for media, for youth engagement. We don't do, and like, you know what? Forget you. I'm going to go to parking lots and ask my friends for money because that's where I can crowdsource funding. But so that podcast is, it's extraordinarily successful in the podcast space. But what it is for the young people who are engaged, and what the young people who have created it and been a part of making it bring into our work every day, is that, look, don't tell me what I am able to learn and not able to learn. If I'm interested in this topic, I can read anything. I'll read a book that's really hard and that's really difficult. And then I will be able, as a 14 to 20-year-old, to interview the person who wrote that book. So we track that person down until they say yes, which is also a fun exercise of training young people. So look, it's a grown-up. They have a calendar. The question is just, how do you convince them that giving you an hour of their time is worth it, right? So
Mm.
pitch yourself, pitch the story, pitch the project, and then show up and crush it, right? Like this is someone who's a famous historian, someone a big name. Do a good job.
So
But
wait, where do you source these youth
they
interviewers?
find them. So these kids, we've had everyone
No, no,
from.
where do you find the kids? Like,
Oh, the
how do you
kids! Oh, the kids! The first crowd was Victor's friends. My
is each episode done by a different kid?
Yeah.
And
So
how
they
is that?
usually stay. They stay. It's for a summer, so they spend
Okay.
the summer working on the
Uh-huh.
project. And I think they usually don't leave, they come back. And
So
so
each kid will do multiple interviews or just one?
each kid will do one a year because it's a
One
massive
interview a
process.
year.
One interview a year because you have to
Wow.
read the whole, 300 to 800 page book,
And
prepare the interview.
then how do
And
you train the kids to do a good interview?
you train the kids to do a good interview.
You just
You
train them. So they get some training. It's not just like, all
You get
right,
training.
Carl,
Oh, no, no,
because
no, no. That's the
there's
point. No, no,
it's
no.
like
That's the
running a
point.
good
Like that would
conversation.
die. So we first had it's all, my village, right? A wonderful person in my village is Jake Shapiro who was a serial entrepreneur in the podcasting space. And he had some ideas of who you could contact, and he had founded an organization called Public Radio Exchange, and they trained our first generation of podcasters and the second. Uh,
Hmm.
and then we brought in a podcast production company to help do the podcast production. But at this point, we also knew how to train the interviewers. Like that's so that you can
Hmm.
you learn, and the ones who had done it before would sort of peer mentor the other ones. So that's
That's so awesome. I mean, that I just want to pause there for a second because there's so many dimensions of that is just so awesome. Like beyond just like, oh, we're learning history in a new way, is the peer mentorship, the training, the getting the kids out of their comfort zone to reach out to these big name people, to like all the skills involved in the micro details of that, the sheer like direct experience of empowerment
yeah.
is just amazing.
Yeah, it was awesome. And to see, the last year I took two of them to a big, the biggest ed tech conference that there is in the US. It's this big, flashy, 6,000 people in San Diego, and it's all the grown-ups that are running around trying to pitch their products and ideas to transform education. And no young people there. But we had two of our podcasters come and they did a panel, which we got past because we had two very famous people on the panel. But whatever, I knew the famous people. So we had the famous people and our podcasters. So we got the panel slot for this big conference. But then they went around and interviewed all these other famous innovators in the education space.
They
And
are
which is
on site
on
or
site. Yeah, they just sit
okay.
down spontaneously and sit down under a tree and find a sort of quiet-ish place. And we had little cheap lavalier microphones, and then they would
Mhm.
sit and interview them. And then we made a special episode about innovation and what that looks like.
So you like
But
splice that into one episode, one
yeah,
podcast
we
episode.
spliced
Hmm.
it into one podcast. So the editing
Hmm.
is heavy, right? To make it a good narrative, like this from the world of creating learning and videos, like editing down the
Mm.
pieces so that it becomes something that is actually
And the
uh
kids do the editing as well, or you have a production
no no
company?
no 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 we have a production company.
Hmm.
Editing is very hard. Like it takes a lot of time, and we
Yeah.
pay the kids for their time in the summer, but that's as much time as they really have in
Hmm.
the summer to do the interview. And the
Hmm.
editing is too much. You could probably, if you had the whole school year, you could do the editing with them, but
Hmm.
we don't have the whole year.
Do you feel
Yeah.
like most of the audience for the podcast is youth or adults?
So it's a mix. The we track this, right? And we see what the age range is. So bizarrely, our highest listenership is in the 30 and 40s age range. Um, uh, which isn't either it's not the parents of the young people, and it's not the kids themselves. But it's pretty distributed. Like, so there's a
Mm.
chunk of the 30s, 40s, and then some, but we haven't done very much targeted or skilled marketing and distribution into the world of the teen audience and how to get it into classrooms. So there are
Mm.
different strategies that you can go for in that direction. And we're just working with someone to figure out what the best way is to approach that. But um, yeah, we're
Mm.
still learning. But now at least we have a good product now. The first couple of seasons were a little bit not bumpy. They were great. And it's much better now, obviously, that you're in your fourth season. And so but we're very excited to have that both cohort of young people that is a stable of trained youth spokespeople and advocates and journalists, and they can go on stage anywhere, right? They say, "Oh, sure."
Mm.
One of them did a live interview with Gloria Steinem the day after Roe v. Wade was overturned in the U.S. And
Mm.
Gloria Steinem is a big deal in the women's rights movement, and but this kid was 17, and she's like, "Oh yeah, no problem. I've got
That's
Gloria
it.
Steinem."
I mean, I think it's so important to, as an entrepreneur, to work with what you have. And one of the things that can be leveraged is youth. It's something like, oh, you're too young. But the other side of that is, if a 17-year-old is reaching out to some big name person, that big name person is going to be more likely to give that 17-year-old attention than a 35-year-old, unless that 35-year-old has like some really good credentials. So there's something there about you really got to like hustle with what you have, and being young in itself can be an advantage.
Yeah, no, 100%. But then you sort of teaching them or training them how to write the email properly, right?
Right,
So
right.
obviously there were missteps, and sometimes they wrote, sometimes they, as teenagers will do, you'll say this is how the email has to be written, then they don't write it that way, then they don't get a response. You have to go back and they're like, well, I don't read my email. So we have an amazing youth program director who has figured out how to make sure that the students actually read the email
Mm,
that we
mm,
send or that they
mm,
send or that she figures out. So she runs this all by herself. I have very little to do with it at this point. We have a extraordinary young director of the program now who does all of that by herself. So
mm.
she's running the entire thing, and is herself 23. So
Wow.
technically in the space of being a very rather young person, and close in age to the ones that are aging out. But yeah, so that was one piece of
Mm,
the triangle where I couldn't have invented Victor, but I had Victor at the breakfast table, and we're like, okay, great, this is
mm,
awesome. Or on the other big pillar of work that we do, which is weaving local ecosystems that are aligned around the same goal of helping young people thrive in this way and build relationships in their community for learning. I had the abstract idea and was at a conference, and the conference was pretty boring, but there was a lunch on ecosystems. This is, I just started, and I just went to the lunch to see, well, that sounds interesting. And someone was at the lunch sitting next to me from Kansas City from a foundation. And he said, oh, that sounds interesting what you're doing on civics and history and social studies and ecosystems. I wasn't actually doing anything yet. I had an idea. It was a drawing on
you
a
were
piece of
talking
paper.
about it. You were
I
talking
was
about
talking about it. I had this great
it.
idea. Like I thought this was a great idea. And he said, "Why don't you come out to Kansas City? I know a couple of people that might be interested." So I went out to Kansas City, and I did this wonderful tour with one of the people from his network and community, an elderly gentleman who was magical, is magical, a magical human being, who picked me up in his car at the airport and started driving me around to the people that I would need to know. The fancy lady from Boston, what he always called me. Fancy lady from Boston, I'm going to introduce you to some
You
people.
you you were the fancy lady from
I
Boston.
was the fancy lady from Boston. And he'd always make
Nice.
fun of me. He's like, this is Dr. Raine, the fancy lady from Boston. I'm like, I'm not a fancy lady from Boston. He's like, this is my fancy lady from Boston. So the fancy lady from Boston, we went to different places and met different people. And one of the people was this incredible teacher, Emily Wegner, who was a social studies coordinator in Kansas City, who already had sensed and seen the same issue and need that I had and was trying to build it and trying to connect it and think about how do we do inquiry-based learning, but it has to be in the community because teachers can't do this by themselves. And had this group, and she was like, I don't really know how to get from where I am with this group of people and this interest to where we want to go. And I was like, well, let's do it together. Let's figure this out. So this was in 2019, and then we built over the last 4 years an ecosystem in Kansas City that has all the different museums and libraries and archives, and a process for helping teachers in the region co-design together with the institutions in the region learning experiences that are real world, community connected, and inspiring for young people, that create space for young people to show up as creators and as leaders. We got very lucky in that region because the districts had passed a new sort of programmatic commitment to real world learning through this Kauffman Foundation, the guy who came to the conference in Boston. So all young people in all of the districts have to do some sort of real world learning to get a credentialed high school degree, right? You have to
Hmm.
get a school diploma plus you have to do real world learning. And so what the teachers were wanting to do, which is to create more inquiry-based, curiosity-based, place-based learning, and what the district was saying was needed was exactly the same, but you needed to make a link between the
Hmm.
two. Because real-world learning is like, okay, we'll put the kids into hospitals and car shops and pharmacy, whatever. Like it's obviously usually STEM-oriented, but I was like, making an exhibit of art on what this history means to you is also real world. If the kids put on an exhibit at the presidential library with their art pieces that show how their identity is connected to the stories in the museum, that's real world learning because the kids get to put
Hmm.
them. And so we started just taking the program that was set out that wasn't directly supposed to be aligned with civic learning and people's history and their identity and their self, and just put what we wanted to do into that container, and it worked perfectly. So we have have had the tremendous opportunity to be offering a piece into a system that was already set up, not for our purposes, but for adjacent purposes, and to make it work together for the same goal. So she's still very much part of our team, and unfortunately not here this week because of ice and snow in Kansas City.
Hmm.
But that kind of finding people that have a piece of the vision and be like, okay, yes, what you're wanting to build and what you're sensing and seeing and creating and the superpowers you have are what we need to make that piece of the vision come to life, right? And
Mm.
that's become sort of the process. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. And I have so many questions about, first of all, this local ecosystem structure that you created. So as far as I understand, it involves a collection of partner museums and libraries, as well as a collection of teachers that are kind of signed up for this thing, that are also somehow coordinating, collaborating lesson plans. And then there's students that are then going to these museums to create their own exhibits, or participating in these museums to discover art through a kind of a conversational, dialogical kind of way, or something like that. So maybe unpack the, like a specific example for me, like a
Process,
little
yeah.
more. Yeah.
So the key piece is to integrate this into what school is, right? So you can do
Mm,
out of school time, and out of school time is lovely. We love out of school time. But if we want to change school, because that's where 99% of kids end up getting most of their learning, we've been trying to figure out how do we make school incorporate the ability for young people to engage with and in their communities and do parts of their projects for their classes in connection with a community institution.
mm,
So, for example, if you're doing a course on the Cold War, you can do a piece of your you can do the performance task of your unit of your class in connection with an institution. So you can, for example, create a traveling trunk for lower schoolers with elements from a museum that will allow the third graders to engage with topics of conflict and war, because it's part of the curriculum for third graders. They have to talk about World War I or whatever it is. So you as a high schooler can make as part of your learning, not to just write a 5-paragraph essay, but you can go to the World War I museum, go and curate with the curators there, find the pieces that would be exciting, write about them, and put together a little case of stuff that could make it interesting and playful for third graders to engage with the materials that are in that around the topic that the kids are supposed to learn. So there's a triple bonus of that. The high schooler gets their grade for doing a good job on something. The something provides value to the community institution and
mm.
to the third graders. So the World War I Museum is excited because they have something that's really neat that they can show that
So
teenagers.
that case would reside at the museum as kind of a showpiece or something that the
Yeah, it's
third
something
graders
that
could
you can
interact with.
borrow, that you can, it's sort of traveling trunks that the museums have
Mm,
these sort of kits, right?
mm.
Um, and they can be online ones that you can download now in the digital era. They don't have to be physical trunks. You don't have to have like a fake pipe in it, right? You can do that. Um, if you want to, but that creates a barrier that you have to get the actual physical trunk somewhere. But there are different ways to play with this, and different students have done different things, right? But to create a kit that will allow a teacher, an elementary teacher, to go into a classroom and say, hey guys, you know what? Here's something really special. We're going to be talking about an interesting topic. And if you're lucky, you can get the high schoolers to come in and introduce it if they have time and if
Mm,
the teacher allows, right? If
mm,
they're not too
mm.
far away. But then again, you get the sort of multiple benefit of having the teaching. Like when teenagers teach, they understand the topic much
That's
more.
amazing. Yeah,
And
of
it was so
course.
fun. Like some of these kids were so funny. They were saying uh they were excited about it and they were making this stuff. And then towards the end, one of them was like, oh my God, holy, expletive, my stuff actually matters. Like if I don't
Mm.
do a good job, these kids are not going to know what they need to know.
Right,
Like
right.
I
It's
actually
not
need
just a teacher
something.
reading some essay
That's just
that,
the teacher. And what do I really care what the teacher thinks about my essay?
right.
100% not. Um,
Mm,
but do I care about what Jimmy's little sister is going to learn? Right?
mm.
Jimmy's little sister, she's cute, she's nice. Like I want to do a good job for Jimmy's little sister. So it sort of flips the so that's an example of the kind of project that goes in there, right? So that is in that ecosystem. there's a lot of work that goes into that, right? One of them is a key part of it is aligning the different players to be about whole child development and whole child learning, and to shift their understanding of what learning usually is, which is get all kids to understand X amount of stuff and to perform to X degree so that they meet the criteria that the school system has said is what good school is. And instead to say, do you actually understand that every young person needs certain things before they can know stuff, right? And you need to understand who they are and how they feel a sense of connection and belonging first. And how do you build that and create that as an invitation and to spark their curiosity? And there's so much you need to understand. We have communities with 70-80% migration background, right? In these schools. Can you imagine what it is like for a classroom like that to be sat down with the US history textbook where you're like, okay, this is what you need to know. This is the story of America. So welcome on board. Number one, the Indians came here in 1492. Or the Indians. Columbus came here in 1492. And we had some people here before, but like the absurdity of that narrative to be something that a young person at that age would find either interesting or connected to who they are is completely ludicrous, right? Completely ludicrous. And so when you look at the statistics of how history teaching has been successful over time, for the last 120 years, it's only been 15% of students that are ever proficient in history in this country. 15. 15, 85% are just not. And it's always been that way. And so you look at it and you're like, has everyone ever thought of the fact that what and how we're teaching doesn't actually work for the kids? And then you look at how history is used to build community and to build courage and to build connection in general, like throughout time. And you're like, it's so much about relationships and connection to who am I in this world? How do I feel seen with my full story in where I am right now, and be able to be invited into a community of creation and connection and building together. But there are many layers of realization that belong into that process, right? So when we create these ecosystems, we try to talk about what is it that we understand, what do we think belongs into this idea of civic learning or your whole human being. And what people surface when you ask them an open question and say, look, it's not about the three branches of government, right? When we talk about civics, that's not it. What do we mean? And what they come up with is exactly all this stuff that learning scientists will say is key, even if they've never read the book. They'll say it's about belonging and it's about community and it's about relationships. It's about connection. It's about feeling responsibility. It's about, okay, great. So you surface that and say, well, how do we together ensure that every child gets that? Every child. Who's got what piece? Who's where physically, geographically? Who's got what elements? What kind of, because there are different kinds of kids. So how do we make sure that there's a web through which kids don't fall, or a net, right? They can't fall through the cracks of caring and of relationships. We have to create a relational web in which every kid somehow will be carried and will not be feels like they're falling through the cracks. But that's all about us being in touch with each other as adults to know, how do we notice, how do we see, how do we channel, how do we help switchboard, so that kids aren't left to the luck of the draw of who their parents are, right? There's a big movement on parents' rights in the US and in Florida. I don't know whether this heard about this, but this whole idea of like parents know best what's for their kids. Always. And I was like, I don't know. And like, yeah. Like, have you ever talked to kids about their relationship as a teenager with their parents? Like, do you really think we have like that age between 12 and 18, not to say that we're going to create a Sparta or a, Rome, or the system where you take the kids away from their parents and put them into a state-run system. That's not what we're talking about. But how is this about, how do we align as a community to say, sometimes parents, obviously they love their child deeply and they will know a lot, but kids are different from their parents. They're not them. And
Mm.
how do you create a school space that is safe for kids to then evolve and to become someone that their parents could never have dreamed they could become?
Mhm.
Because we're parents and we have limited imaginations of what we think is possible for our kid. Why do we have to limit who they are just because we are who we are, right? And so there's that tension, right, between in the school system and a family system and a local community, that you have to say, how do you create an architecture of learning where, as the kid is growing up, finding their sense of self, it always can find a place where it is safe and nurtured and supported in becoming who they are without being limited either by their parents or by what the school thinks they can do.
Mm.
And that it's complicated, right? This isn't it's an organic and fluid process, but one that requires that commitment that every young person has to have the relationships and the connections that allow them to feel seen and powerful and loved,
Mm.
and to experience those relationships fully, because otherwise the their whole biology, if you look at how a kid's body reacts to the influence of adults telling them they can't do something or
Mm.
that they're not enough or that they're being judged, it's stress, it's toxic stress, it's physically toxic to them,
And it
and
lasts into adulthood. It
it
doesn't go
lasts
away.
into adulthood and it doesn't go away. So it's a somatic process.
Mm.
And I'm learning all this stuff now. I love learning about this. It's not my field. I'm just a historian who understands the outcome, how people behave. But I'm like, oh my God, there's so much to be understood, so that you trigger the sense of joy and safety and hope in a kid, so that it can grow into that role of ownership, right?
Mm.
Anyway.
We're talking about kids here, but I really also just appreciate so many facets of what you're talking about, and also the relevance to the way that adults learn. And what really stands out for me is just the relational dimension of first, and how perfect it fits with the topic of history. Because as you said, like history is something we're always making. It's not just some subject matter. And even as you're talking about it, I'm like, holy shit, like yeah, I'm this is history right now, moment to moment, whether it's family history or just the history of our relationship, in the making in this moment. And history is always being made into, and also that history is always relational. It always exists in a relational context. It's not it doesn't exist outside of some kind of relational understanding. And to make that come alive for kids, to make that come alive in a learning experience where you get to discover yourself, you get to discover history in this way, and give people an opportunity to learn that way. Yeah, it's really inspiring. I'm really touched, and I'm really present to the complexity of what you're talking about, like at least from the receiving end of what I'm hearing of what it has taken to, in some ways you've created this like really beautiful structure, at least in the way you've described the local ecosystem between the students, the teachers, the local institutions like the museums and the libraries, and then the local school system, and what they're saying the priority is, and somehow fitting into all the, like there's so many little things that you are leveraging and combining to create this new opportunity, right? To create this new possibility in a really powerful way. So I'm kind of, I don't even know what question to ask there, but there's something about it that feels like you're dealing with so much complexity, and somehow navigating it so gracefully to create something that's really interesting. That's in some way really novel. So I wonder if you can like share some reflections on that complexity, and kind of what it's taken to connect those dots into this new structure.
With pleasure. And I think the answer that first pops into my mind is relationships, right?
Mm.
Everything is about relationships. So I at some point worked at McKinsey for a couple of years, and we did this sort of profiling of your personality, right? Who you are and how you operate in the world. And I had done all these psychological profiles, and the person who was there, talking to us about our evaluation was a psychologist. And she sat down with me and looked at this and was like, um, you are off the chart someone who gets their energy from being with other people. Like, you're not even on my chart. You're so off the chart on being an extroverted person. Um, why on earth did you think that getting a PhD was a good idea? Like, you are so not made to be an academic. Why on earth did you do that? Like, you clearly are someone who lives in relationship. And so I think all of it is about relationships and sensing, again, like I said, in other people a similar yearning, right? And you find it every. You can find it in with a group of random high schoolers that you invite into a workshop. We just did this a couple of weeks ago where we said we're trying to reinvent the education system for American democracy. There's this whole project. It feels like it's not right for teen audience, like the language is off. So we asked a teacher to send a couple kids. They came in, and these kids showed up. I'd never met them, from a vocational high school in Queens, in New York. Most incredible young people ever. And they show up full heart and soul for the project, full commitment for 4 hours. They hang out with us. We feed them pizza. They didn't even know they were going to get a gift card. They got a gift card, but they were just there to show up because they said, wow, some grown up bothered to say, do you want to help me redesign the future of education? They showed up heart in, soul in, everything in, designing, creating. And first we were working with them. And after about an hour, they came to me and said, do you mind if we just, do you mind just leaving us alone for a while? We've got this. We've got this. We've got the design part. Like, you guys are great and we love working with you, but we just need some time to actually design and work because you're a little bit in our way. And I was like, yeah, no problem. So they went off and created amazing ideas and outlines and pieces that we carry forward in our work. So if you see it as a super complex project that you have to control, it's impossible. If you see it as a project where you're like, this is where the world has to go, and there are a lot of people that want to get there. It's not me making a plan. There is objectively a future for which many people have a yearning and a longing. So let's figure out, how do we get our energies to combine toward that? And then it's just all fun, right? It's that you just go around shopping for, it's like Robin Hood. Like, you want to go and like get there together, and they're like, oh my god, that's so fun. Yeah, 100%. So that not trying to over design and be open to opportunity so that you're always creating and co-creating and weaving together is, I think, the name of the game. Why it's also not exhausting. It's entirely generative. Like, anytime I look at my calendar, I'm like, I'm so blessed because my whole day is about connecting people, ideas, and sometimes it's about connecting other people with each other and being like, I need you in the puzzle to be playing this role in my grand scheme of things, right? Sometimes it is about scheming. Like, this is where the future needs you to be. In order for you to see that, if I tell you it's not going to be that powerful, but I have someone who is really, really amazing. And if I have her tell you, because she's, the goddess in the field and I know her, you'll take it from her and that will do a whole nother level. So architecting relationships, like connecting triangles, is what June Holly calls it, right? The sort of in the network weaving. How do you connect triangles? Because when you connect triangles, sometimes that turns into amazing power. So I just heard that at a big conference I'm going to, two people where I connected the network triangle. I was like, you need to talk to that person. Are keynoting it together. They're opening the conference together, setting the whole stage for the entire conference. I was like, yes, it's exactly what we needed. Right. But you can't, it's not my win. I mean, I'm excited that it happened. And yes, I connected the dots, but that for me in my work, it's not my project success. And it's us getting there, right? It's that seeing how through relationships you can just accelerate the journey toward this vision that we have of a world of thriving. So I think that sort of seeing it as a complex puzzle that you have to control is exhausting. Seeing it as something that's already happening, where your only job is to prevent it from not happening.
Mm.
Does that make sense? Like
Mm-hmm.
to feel like history's on your side. This is where
Mm-hmm.
we've got to go. So how do we remove obstacles to get there? And
Mm.
not it's less engineering and more allowing a river to flow so that it can actually carve a new path, right?
Mm. Mm.
Um, and that's a different process than making a business plan. I used to think that's how you made change, right? You make a business plan and then you go do it. And we still have a business plan, but it's a business plan of this is the journey, and I don't know who's going to come in. I don't know what rivers are going to join our river. And I don't know what other curves we're going to have to go because this funder didn't come through. Because funders, you know what funders are like in this space, right? Like they say they'll come through, then they don't come through. They say they'll come through now, then they come through in 3 years. Like,
Mm.
and you always have to not get frustrated by being adaptive, right? If you're too focused on one only possible version, it never is going to work out that way because that's not how life works and that's not how money works. So if you just see it as, oh gosh, that's great, then we'll go the different curve and then we'll go see that tree and the flowers that are on that side. That's beautiful too. And we'll do the
Mm.
little detour, but we still know where we're headed.
Mm.
So I
Mm.
think that for me is the real energy and the key to navigating complexity is just embracing the magic of human relationships,
Mm.
and celebrating the heck out of it, right? And seeing like why is it so amazing when people can, through connecting with each other, just create amazing things? That kind of is a great
Mm.
business to be in, right? Like how do you be in the business of creating the opportunity for people to co-create experiences, things, amazing projects? Um,
Do you have any particular, so I really appreciate this relational dimension and I want to kind of get down into the weeds for a minute, but in terms of partnerships, like so you're at the beginning of your Kansas City ecosystem project and you're like, okay, here are the museums and libraries that would be good. Like what does that look like? Are you getting on the phone and calling the director of the museum? Are you looking for a friend of a friend, or do you already have someone that has that network? You're shaking your head. So what is the
all
initial like
what's there, it's always
all of
there.
the
Like
above?
the people that are there, right? That have
Mm,
relationships, right?
mm,
You
mm.
start off and then you find the ones that are particularly strong ties, right? The ones that are strong people. So we had some event,
Mhm.
we invited a couple museums, two people showed up that were totally amazing. You build around the two people, you give them, it's just about that, right? You make friends, you create vision, you create power, you create voice. You say what you're doing is exactly in this direction. They're like, really? You're like, yeah, 100%. And so
Mm,
it's words, relationships and words create those structures, right? If you frame something as something through words and storytelling, it becomes a reality, right? It becomes a shared story. But that is like you can be doing something and have no idea that what you are doing is part of what someone else is seeing. But if you name it and you then create more, you create a frame for it and a term for it, that can become amplified and magnified. So the power of using words strategically to describe, name,
mm.
create formats for something is critical, right?
Mm,
So in each of the regions, so right now we're in Kansas City, and we're just coming into work with Pittsburgh, which has always been my dream because Remake Learning is an incredible project in the US that builds ecosystems of learning with such love, such a focus on relationships, such a focus on awe and wonder and human magic with all the people involved in it.
this is a different organization?
This is Remake Learning is an organization
Remake
and a
Learning.
foundation in Pittsburgh,
Okay.
and they have been doing this ecosystem work for years and years and years and years, but usually focus on STEM, right? Because that's
Mm,
where the future of learning was. And we connected with them, and now we are partnering with them to build out the civic learning ecosystem through the lens that we use in Kansas City. And we did a pilot event there with young people and teachers and out of school providers and whatever. And it was incredible, just the generative energy and the potential that came out of that. But it's not, we don't want to be running that. That's theirs in the end to shape and run. Somehow it's going to be a local team. We're just there to catalyze the right players into the right conversation because I don't want to be an organization with 20 teams in 20 cities, like hoping that I'm going to get the 21st city next year if I just raise X money, right? Like, how do you create something that allows organizations that are able to scale? Like Remake is in 13 cities with what they do. If we do work well in Pittsburgh, that can spread in many different ways. And if we do work in Dallas, where Big Thought is, that's also working in different cities, that can also spread in different ways. So you're trying to work with people that in and of themselves can take ideas and make them grow. Welcoming America, amazing organization, welcoming communities, working with them to see how do we make your idea incorporate this. It's not that much, it's not particularly brilliant what we're doing, right? Like this isn't rocket science. It's not a trained team of people that shows up and builds a civic learning ecosystem. It's like, come on, it's a conversation, it's a set of tools, a set of ideas, but anyone can do this. And so how do you build partnerships that allow this kind of way of building relationships and being and focusing on the future being of our young people to come together? But that doesn't require a local team specifically, because there are local teams that care, but just giving tools that will allow them to do this better. So that's sort
So
of how we do.
in a partnership like that, let's say in Pittsburgh with an organization like Remake, which I know like nothing about, I just heard about right now, but does that, are you saying it works, that partnership works in a way that you basically say, hey, we've been doing this in Kansas City, partnering with museums and teachers and kind of doing this kind of thing. We think this would work really well in Pittsburgh. You guys already have like an on-site team that you're doing related stuff, but not this stuff. And we'd love to partner with you to basically show you how we do this model and how you can deploy your resources to implement this model in Pittsburgh, something like that.
Right. That's right. And the way that works is like there was a Zoom meeting on ecosystems that was hosted by a WISE working group on learning ecosystems, right? 3 years ago, pretty much at the beginning. And I was in a Zoom breakout room with a guy from the Lego Foundation who was amazing, and this guy from Grable Foundation from Remake Learning who was amazing. And I was like, I need to work with you. You're amazing. Like, I don't know how I'm going to work with you, but I will work with you.
That's
You're
how I
amazing.
felt about interviewing you.
Exactly. You're amazing. And so 2 years later, I was working with Lego. 3 years later, I was working with Pittsburgh. But you just like, you build relationships, you find them at conferences, you go talk to them, you go figure it out, you listen, you read their stuff, you look at what you're doing, you align, and you're like, but it's again, it's like, oh, you have a piece, you have a torch too, right? Let's go together. And you feed me with what you've done, and your insights are so inspiring and so amazing. And I think we could take it to the next level if we connect the triangle, right? So it's all that, all of it. It's that.
I love it, and it resonates so much because of our own journey with Sutra. First, I want to go back to the podcast thing, and what I really appreciate about that is like the simplicity and the tangibility of something, right? There's this big vision you have for creating a new learning operating system, and then there's this like first step, which is a youth-driven podcast, and it's so simple, and at the same time, it has so many dimensions and layers to it, and it's like real, and it gets you in contact with students and is something in the real world, and that's something that we talk about all the time with with us. Like my vision for Sutra was world peace. It's like there isn't a more audacious, abstract, ambiguous, like what does that even mean, goal or vision than that. But then through this long process of just like step by step tangible iteration, translating that into group learning experiences that invite meaningful connection, conversation, presence, and relational capacity building, right? So it becomes really tangible through that process. And of course, the way that we've gotten there has been entirely through the hustle of like the hustle bustle of relationships and connecting and sharing and communicating and iterating and trying and connecting dots. And also I want to like the point you mentioned about like the framing, like the context, the way that you name things and make them relevant, and the way that you make them seem like opportunities and possibilities for the people that you're working with. Like I like, so I resonate so much with everything that you've outlined as how you've gone from this enormous big vision into like very tangible outcomes and impact.
It's been fun. It is fun. It will be fun. And who knows where it will go, but I have a lot of learning to do from you all as well, because one of the things that is very much on our radar is thinking about how do we weave communities of learning among these adults. Like we have a couple of adults, right, that that want to be learning also together, because there are things that there's some stuff that they need to know. There thoughts about how kids learn that are totally outdated, right?
Mm.
Absolutely outdated, and that keep teachers from embracing every young person in the kind of way that a young person wouldn't necessarily need to be thriving, right?
Mm.
So we have a lot of replacing and renewing of understanding to do about whole child learning, and not just us, but Pam Cantor's team and the turnaround team and the iThrive team and the Reimagine. Like there are a lot of us that see this, and so how do we create learning uh, on the stuff? The content is interesting, but also learning
Hmm.
community. We
Right.
don't know. Right? We need to get to learning communities that are actual learning communities. We have a lot of designing to do and co-designing. So I hope that we can find a way
Mm.
to learn together and co-design in that space, because it is going to be essential in the next 5 to 10 years to figure out a new formats of this kind of learning together, and where the learning is building community and the community is advancing learning, and it's that sort of
Hmm. Hmm.
cycle of relationships and learning and community and love and ties. I mean, the isolation and the silos of the world and the polarization, all that is a result of the fact that we don't do learning communities. What are churches and religious communities? They used to be learning communities
Hmm.
where you show up and you learn together, and you talk about the Bible, you'll talk about the Quran, you talk about whatever you want to talk about. But you show up together, you sit there, you have rituals, you do stuff, and that's how you build a religion that lasts for 2,000 years. Well,
Hmm.
that's struggling, right? In the world, no shakes against religion. Religion still has its role, but there's a this what we're doing here in terms of human thriving and thinking about well-being is a sort of secular religion of a focus on love and relationships and
Mm.
connection. It's trans
Hmm.
religious, right? We can't be
Hmm.
siloed in that anymore. And so how do we have to approach it with the same focus
Mm.
uh, that allows people, regardless of their religious affiliation, regardless of their national affiliation, regardless of their gender affiliation, whatever their affiliations might be, cross the affiliations and come to a place where we have that a learning space and a learning commitment to our human core and the well-being of the planet as well, in connection with our own human thriving. Like that, we have to reinvent that. It's a post nation state world, right?
Hmm.
We're in
Mm.
a new time. Nation states are great for whatever they're great for. Taxes, wars. I don't know what they're great for.
They're great for wars.
They're great for wars. Maybe for school systems, not really. But
I don't
we're
know.
not going
I
to get
think the
rid of
school
them
systems
anytime
lose
soon.
out to the wars. Yeah, but
Ah!
I think there's something so, so for honestly,
Stop in a second.
in the context of transformational learning, like this quality of learning space that you're describing, like for me that's where it's at. And I love that you brought in the church thing, because like what happens in church, I mean, obviously there's the whole religion part about it, but I think the reason people go to church is really for that sense of belonging in a way that is also spiritual. And what does spiritual mean? Yeah, I mean, that's obviously a huge question, but to feel seen, to feel heard, to be with people that have a similar devotion and commitment to you, and in that context to exchange. Like if you're in a church community, and especially I imagine this was true like much longer ago, but people talk about the crops and what's going on at home. There's learning that occurs through that communication, and so I think that same model of learning spaces where people are in a community of practice, sharing meaningful insight and information in a way that's deeply relational and human, that is a form of deep spiritual connection that all of us are yearning for. And it doesn't have to happen in the context of a church. It can happen in the context of a community that is learning together. And I think that's really the transformation.
Exactly. And just on that note, there just call outs of some of my favorite people that are in that space and working in that space is a new book that Landon Mascareñas and Donnie Tran wrote called Open Systems, about basically creating brave spaces in communities to reignite
Mm.
a sense of community and democracy through this sort of shared learning and thinking about the future of learning. Amazing, amazing people that have done community oriented work in the US. And the other who was the other person who just flashed into my mind? Well, obviously Brendan Johnson and Fido Network and the work they're doing about learning networks and learning spaces. And then Eric Liu, who is an incredible person who created something called Civic Citizen University, where he tried to institute this right of civic Saturdays, where we come together with sort of a neutral, secular religious connection as a community to democracy. For me, I think the limitation is a little bit on the definition of civics that for a lot of people is exclusive, right? Like democracy and democratic structures and civics as they currently are not seen as necessarily for everyone, right?
Mm.
Because of the way history has panned out. But the idea is great. And it's just this sort of deep embracing of the idea that if we just create intent and commitment and spaces for love and belonging and that sort of, so there's a lot of inventing. I'm excited. This is the era of inventing around relationships and community.
Mm. It
For
really is. It really
this is
this was not available 100 years ago
no,
in
it was
this way
not.
in
It
the
was not.
mainstream. You know, and now we have all this awareness around like mindfulness practices and relational capacities, and so there's an understanding of the scientific neurobiological reality
Exactly.
that is also a factor in the availability of this as a praxis for modern life, and I think that's where we're going right now. Like that's
Exactly.
it's amazing.
Exactly. This is the era of new power and new hope, new relationships, new forms of
Mm.
community building. And so I'm not scared of AI at all. Right. People are like, oh my God, AI, the doomsday. I'm like, do you know what's happening? Don't you feel it? Aren't you plugged in to the great resurgence of humanity? Like, man, you need to be part of our
So,
world because we're at it, we're on it, we have it,
mm.
we're in it. So yeah,
So
thank you
as
for
I think
connecting.
as we wrap up here, I have one last question that kind of sparked for me because I've heard you say this like casually throughout our conversation. You're like, I just felt it. Do you feel it? So I want to ask you about that, right? There's so something I'm sensing in the way that you operate is that you feel things, and then that becomes kind of like a thread for you to follow. So, like, can you say a few words about like what that means for you to feel something, or like you feel like this potential that's emerging in humanity, or a situation or a project you're working on? How do
I
you
don't
relate to
know.
that?
I mean, I don't. It's this resonance, and I've never thought about why I have it. Maybe it's because I grew up in the streets of New York City in the late 1970s, where there's like
That's how
danger
you
and
survived.
stuff everywhere, right? Like you kind of like, okay, you need to sense where they're good people and where they're not good people because you're
Mm,
walking through a
mm,
world that's super dangerous. Maybe that's it. Like I don't know. I haven't analyzed my own brain. But just a sense of, and this is how I raised my kids. Like they didn't have cell phones until they were in high school because it was like, look around you and sense goodness. There's goodness everywhere. And if you ever feel threatened by something, look around and there's going to be someone good around you and just go
mm.
attach yourself to them. There'll be some little old lady or some guy. And so the number of cell phone calls I've gotten from unknown numbers that are like, hi, I have your daughter X. I have four daughters. We're in Chinatown. She's lost. What should I do? And like,
Mm,
but yeah, there are good people everywhere. My LA angel, the guy who got her an Uber to get her home when she was 10 and lost and whatever. But that assumption that the world is full of good people is something that I've always kind of had. And if you have that as your premise, you just go around looking for what does it feel like? You feel the resonance. Like you can feel it in a Zoom room.
yeah,
The
for
woman
sure. I mean, yeah.
merged our organizations. We met in a Zoom room and neither of us were talking and we're just looking at each other and we're like,
Mm,
yeah, like something
mm.
about how you're vibing with what's vibing here. And I
Wow.
don't know, we're
Mm.
vibing. So I don't know what vibing is as a technical term, but your radar is up, right? Because there's goodness. There is
Mm.
goodness everywhere. And if you just have your radar up and go look for the live wires of that kind of the places I have met, my whole life journey has been things like that. Going like every job I ever had, including McKinsey and Ashoka, were meeting people at cocktail parties or dinners or events where you're just somewhere and you're like, oh, I see you in a room, we're going to connect, and then you have a conversation and that becomes your thread.
Mm.
Everything about my life has been that.
Mm.
Everything. And people are always like, why? And you're like, well, I met a person. I met this person. We were in a coffee shop and we were in the line for a coffee at 6 in the morning and we met and it was, oh my God. And now we're partners and now we work together all the time. It's like that's every single story is that. So
Mm.
I don't know. It's just kind of a way of being that's extremely fun. And this is one of those. So I'm so grateful for this opportunity,
Mm.
Laura. It was wonderful. Thank you.
Fernanda, thank you for such an inspiring conversation. I really appreciate everything you've shared. I feel deep resonance and deep goodness. Thank you.
To be continued,
To
hopefully.
be
Thank you.
continued.